Hello, we are here today with Professor Anthony Welch. He's a professor of education in Sydney University. Thank you for being with us here.
It's
Professor.
a pleasure.
I would like to start the conversation with a quite general question. What are the key trends you have diagnosed in higher education in today's world?
So a lot of my work occurs in Asia. So a lot of my work focuses on East Asia, particularly China, and also on Southeast Asia. So let me pick a couple of elements that I think are important in that region, if you like. A region that's also, of course, close to Australia, which I'll come back to maybe later. What we've seen in those systems, and most spectacularly in the Chinese system, of course, is massification. So in most of the systems in that part of the world, they are just much, much larger than they were. China now has 33 million people enrolled in higher education. That's more than the population of Australia and New Zealand put together. But partly as a consequence, what we've seen is a rise in privatisation, which is not just that we have faster growth of the private sector in higher education relative to the public, but also privatisation of public sector universities, which means they are behaving more like private institutions now than they used to. In turn, that's leading to issues around quality, how you guarantee quality, how you try and ensure quality. Issues of transparency, corruption in higher education is an issue in many parts of the region. Growing inequality, so poorer families are missing out, or even if they do get to higher education, it's a much lower quality institution and program. And so that relates to questions of social stratification.
Yeah.
It's sometimes the case that the people who are already advantaged socially also get the greatest advantage through higher education. So those are some of the trends that are happening that I've analysed in the region.
How about the Australia and Oceania region? Are there any similarities or differences with the general trends in the Asia-Pacific region?
Yeah, I think there are some similarities. One is that as the system expands, and it's expanded hugely in Australia as well, governments face dilemmas about funding that growth, because it's not just higher education that needs money, it's school education, it's health, it's transport, housing, welfare. And so what we've seen in Australia that is similar to those countries that I talked about in East and Southeast Asia is an expanding system, but the budget doesn't expand as fast. So you have a kind of a growing gap between enrolments that are going up like that and the budget that is going up like that, and the gap gets bigger and bigger. What does that mean? It means that families have to pay that difference.
Yes.
So that's something that's reasonably common to both Australia and those other countries. So it shifts the burden more towards families. A second element that's drawing us together has been, because Australia is the only substantial higher education system, English-speaking higher education system in the region, and because we are so close to Asia, so regional partnerships and integration has grown a lot. Yes. So in that sense, there's more similarities too. And of course, there are many more people from Asia now not only studying in our universities, more than 200,000, of which, of course, the Chinese are by far the largest subgroup. Many of them are coming and staying. So they settle down, you know, their kids grow up here and so on. So that's another way in which I think we're growing together. And what that means is we've got, for example, let's take Chinese families again, but you could take Vietnamese families as well.
Okay.
They come with some of those same ideas about the importance of education, how crucial it is to succeed in education and so on. And so their children do very, very well in the Australian system. So that's, you know, that's one way in which connections are growing. Differences, one of the key differences is the way that we finance higher education. So in Australia we have a loan scheme, and you don't actually repay the loan until you graduate, until you get a job, and until your income rises to a certain level. Then the government takes a bit more tax each year until you finish paying the loan. It's reasonably fair. Whereas if there are loan schemes in Asia, and there are, A, they don't work very well, and there's a whole series of technical reasons for that. So that's one key difference, how you finance the system.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. Good thing to learn.
To connect that back to our project, which is University in the Knowledge Economy, we are particularly interested in how universities are enrolled by the government or any other agencies in produce knowledge and workers, and how do you see the new roles for universities in the knowledge economy, especially in the context that you are working in?
I think that's maybe another parallel to a reasonable extent between Australia and many parts of Asia, because what we see going with that knowledge economy discourse is a reframing of higher education. So nowadays, you know, higher education is seen as a pillar of the knowledge economy. It's one of the building blocks. But only if you are in fields or disciplines that are going to be economically useful. So fine if you're an engineer, you know. I work sometimes at Tianjin University. They have lots of engineers and architects. Well, that's fine. But, you know, what about musicians? You know, what about people who study poetry or
philosophy? You
know, yes, exactly, or philosophy or drama or those subjects, you know, or they want to study, you know, the Tang poets or Lao Tzu, you know. Well, it's very interesting, but it's not considered to be economically useful, and so that can be a problem. We used, at my university, I'm at the University of Sydney most of the time, and we used to teach 33 or 35 languages, you know, some of which hadn't been spoken in at least 2,000 years, you know, but now much fewer, you know, and now if we don't offer, let's say, one language, we'll try and work together with another university in the same city and say, all right, you offer this one and we'll offer that one, and the students can, you know, well, that's maybe efficient, but it's not quite that simple, and I think the problem with the problem for us in higher education of the knowledge economy and the dominance of that discourse is that it just really takes the ground away from anything that's not economically useful. So if you're not going to get a good high-paying job, then, you know, why should you study that at university? So I think that's a growing problem.
So we are getting a narrower vision, and it's getting narrower and narrower.
I think so, and a more instrumental and more utilitarian rationale for higher education. Higher education has always produced, you know, people with useful skills. Even 1,000 years ago, they produce, you know, people who could write, for example. Well, that was very useful, or priests who had, you know, a certain job to do, or whatever, or doctors or lawyers. But we don't just want to produce people who are economically useful. You know, there's a lot more to our society than the economy.
It seems that the current higher education development is really sad. But can you think of something very positive? Are there any positive effects of the current higher education?
Yeah, I think there are. And I was thinking about that a little bit. If you compare now with, you know, my generation when we were in school and maybe had the chance to go to university. So, you know, I finished school in the late 1960s, And there was a tiny proportion of my fellow students in those days who went on to university. It wasn't something that everyone expected then. You know, it was only small numbers who went on, and of course the system was much smaller, but it was much more selective. But that was at a time of relatively full employment. So it didn't matter. You know, even if you didn't go to university, even if you left before year 12, which, you know, we 6 and 6, even if you left, instead of finishing at 18, if you left at 16 and got a job in a factory, fine. You know, you could get a job. It may not, you know, be so exciting. It might be a very routine job, might not be a very high-skilled job, but you had a job. You got in, you know, wages, and you could live. So the contrast now is so many people can go to university.
Yes.
You know, the proportion might be, you know, 40% who finish secondary school and then go on. In my day, it was maybe 5%, if that.
Wow.
But the other difference is we now have much higher unemployment for young people. So, there's much more pressure now to finish high school, because if you don't finish high school, you'll never get a job, you know, because no one wants somebody without a high school certificate. But even if you do, and even if you go on to take a degree, there's no question that your chance of being unemployed, if you get a degree, is much lower than if you don't have a degree. So it helps, certainly, to have a degree. But so that's good. I mean, access is unambiguously good. More people going to higher education, you know, that's a good thing. We have a much more highly educated population, and they learn all sorts of new things and so on. But the big difference is that it doesn't necessarily translate into a job, or at least a good job, sometimes not even a job.
That might be the biggest concern for university students.
I think so, yeah, I think so. And, you know, that's happening in China too, as you know. Graduate unemployment is rising, and it can be a major sacrifice, particularly in Asia, where the pattern is often that, you know, families may contribute a lot and sacrifice a lot to send their child or children to university, with the expectation that they will get a good job, and of course the expectation that they will be able to look after the parents in old age. Well, sometimes that's not happening, and okay, that might be all right for a wealthy family because maybe they have their own business or they have other resources, but for poorer families it's a big problem. They make a big sacrifice and they lose.
And they couldn't afford to lose.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's right. So it points to, I think, the fact that there are very differential outcomes in higher education, you know, and the people with the most to lose are sometimes the losers.
Oh, exactly.
In all systems. Yeah.
I have another question, which I'm very curious, is that in the conference we have mentioned about brain drain.
Yes.
Both in African countries and also, for example, in other developing countries, including China. So what do you think about the problem of brain drain? Is there any positive effect, positive things inside of the in this phenomenon, or is totally bad, a bad thing?
Okay, so that's a really good question and a really big question, and we need at least 3 days to answer. It is a complex phenomenon, and it's also the experience of developing countries is not the same. So in Africa they lose huge amounts of talent.
Yes.
And on the whole they don't come back. Some few do, but not so many, for all sorts of reasons, largely because the opportunities are better, you know, in the United States or Australia or Switzerland or wherever they go. But also sometimes to do with wars and, you know, rivalry between different ethnic groups and tribes and so on.
How about the Asian countries?
So in the Asian countries it's also differential. That's where China has a huge advantage, because they have this huge pool of talent overseas, you know, and we've done a lot of research into precisely those people. And the overwhelming majority, not absolutely everyone, but the overwhelming majority of Huachao, overseas Chinese, working in universities in California or Melbourne or wherever it is, they're really interested in China. They're very proud of China's achievements, and they want to help. Even if they have passport and they stay in California or whatever, they go back to China. They do, you know, a short course in the summertime when they're not teaching in California. They look for good PhD students and bring them to California and train them as well. So it's like a rippling wave that gets bigger and bigger. They do research with colleagues, often at their old university. You know, it might be, you know, Beida or Tsinghua or even a smaller university. And they contribute a lot. So in terms of China's dramatic scientific rise, you know, because we're seeing Chinese names now in mainland Chinese names in every field, particularly the sciences and health and medicine and so on. There's so many Chinese names. Well, a lot of the contributions are in fact overseas Chinese. So China has a huge advantage in that sense, that some of the smaller and poorer countries don't. So it is very differential. Korea, something of the same. Taiwan, something of the same. But very different if you're talking about, you know, Laos or Myanmar or those countries.
In that case, I mean, then it is not a simple question of gain and drain.
No.
Because, I mean, it could be a win-win situation for all the countries involved.
Yeah, it can be, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Professor Welch, thank you very much for your time, and we really enjoy your
Thank you.
conversation
I
with you.
enjoyed
Thank you.
talking to you.
Thank you.